Well, in recent years, there's definitely been an increase in tipping expectations since the pandemic. A 2023 Pew Research survey did reveal that about 72% feel that they are now asked to tip service workers more often than before. So joining us now to talk about his offering in this space is Kirk Grogan, co-founder and COO of Tiphaus. Kirk, it's great to have you on the show on a Friday. And as we head into the weekend, what is the proper etiquette when it comes to tipping these days?
Great question. First of all, thank you for having me on. Happy to be here with you all. The proper etiquette is dependent on where you are, right? It really comes down to what is the traditional standard at that location. I think, we talk tip fatigue and things of this nature. Convenience stores, right? Is that really an appropriate place to be offering a tip, to be requested of a tip, all those kinds of fun things? That's where that fatigue really kicks in. When you look at more traditional restaurants where you're being served, you're being sat, or fine dining establishments, I think tipping is very alive and well and justified in those cases.
What if the big question here, and I don't know if this is tip fatigue or tip rage in the case of myself and Americans that I hear from all the time,
Sure.
in particular because of the takeout factor. We all were used to tipping 20% at restaurants, but when you're picking up to-go food, what's the etiquette there?
Great question. So I began my career actually at Chili's when I was 16, and it was one of the busiest takeout locations. This is pre-pandemic. This is many, many years ago now. But typically, no tip is expected in those situations. However, it's always appreciated anytime in the hospitality industry. So that is where we see things like reduced tip rates. 20% probably not necessary there. You're not receiving live service. No one's checking on you, refilling your drinks. But something 3 to 5% is always going to be appreciated. There is still a kitchen staff that must put that together. Of course, there's an expo, there's a QA who's making sure that looks presentable and perfect, and a server is most likely taking time away from his guest on the floor to be able to actually serve you that food, make sure it gets packaged up and paid for. So a reduced rate or significantly reduced rate is probably the correct etiquette there.
Kirk, how does your company come in here and try to help some of these businesses manage and distribute tips to workers?
Sure. So that's actually a great question. That's exactly where we started. As restaurant consultants about 5 years ago, we realized that tips are a necessary component of the service industry, but they're a massive liability, candidly speaking, and they're a headache to deal with. So we are completely automated. We sit on the back end. We tie into the technology stacks that restaurants already use, and we completely automate the process for owners and managers to save them time and money. Beyond that, it's transparency. We want to make sure these employees know exactly what tips they're earning. Are they pooling tips? Are they sharing out? Oftentimes it is very opaque and vague. They cannot figure out how much they've actually given into that tip pool. So we make sure they know exactly what that is. And all that leads to better teamwork, longer tenure for employees, less turnover. And then, of course, the final piece, and often overlooked, but you'll see it in the news almost every day, is the fraud and loss of restaurants. Tips mean a lot of money is moving that's hard to track. And so our system allows you to make sure everything is correct. There's hundreds of lawsuits every year, often the six figures, on accidents, right? Restaurants accidentally messed up an Excel formula. They did not catch that for a year or two. And these lawsuits are the death sentence of these restaurants.
So
or, rarely fraud.
I'm curious, Kirk, in terms of your business model, how much of the tip pool is actually left over for the company? Do you take a cut of that share?
We do not. No, never, never. All tips must be given directly to the individuals that are part of the chain of service. So these are your servers and bartenders, most commonly viewed as, but it can be your host, your bussers, your QA. As a company, we will never touch those. And actually, as a restaurant, that company cannot touch those tips either. 100% of tips must go to the service staff, management, ownership groups, things like that can never take a cut, and that can never be used to pay for services like ourselves.
One of the biggest questions in tipping right now is these food delivery apps and people not factoring in how much these gig workers actually take home at the end of the day. What are your thoughts on that, the gig economy and the food delivery apps, and how important a role it plays, tipping?
Well, it's a great question. And to be honest, it's still a very new industry. I think a lot of that is still being solved. We do not impact or deal with tips directly for those individuals. That's through groups like Uber Eats, DoorDash, et cetera. They must calculate and figure out how much of the tips are actually paid to the drivers, what their wages are for individual payments and things of that nature. The gig economy has grown, right? We can't deny that. If people looking for more flexible work hours, more options to earn more money. So the tips on that front are frankly, they can be high. I'll be candid. I'm a candid, a regular user of Uber Eats, let's say. And so those tips do not go to the restaurants. I mean, that's an important piece to note. That is only going to the driver. Their fee structures and things of that nature on their end, they are completely calculated, but the restaurant ends up actually giving up oftentimes 15 to 30% of that total revenue to those services, in addition to the tips that you're providing, in addition to the service fees. So those are not always benefiting the restaurant, and those tips certainly aren't making it into the restaurant.
It's interesting, Kirk. You know, I'm going to be honest here. The only time I ever really second guess if I should be tipping is if I'm going up, picking up pickup, but this is typically like a coffee, right? I've purchased a coffee at a coffee
Absolutely.
shop, and now they whip around the screen, right? And it's like, do you want to tip 18, 20, 22%?
And they hold it right in your face,
and
right?
they wait to see whether or not you do it. And sometimes it's awkward, you know?
Oh, it's painfully awkward.
So what would you say is the right call in that department?
Great question. And the awkwardness is almost unavoidable at this point, right? It's a tough position. So those are the areas, when I really look at tip fatigue or tip rage, as we utilized earlier, it's a different ballgame when you're talking about quick service restaurants. And by that, I mean things like counter service. Typically, when we're working with groups that bring in a lot of tips, and some of those organizations do not make the mistake of thinking that they're light on it, but we typically recommend a far lower predetermined options, right? Instead of seeing 18, 20, 22, when this was a 30-second interaction, something of 5, 7, and 9 maybe, or 5, 7.5, and 10%. Something so I can give a little bit, but not feel like I've just made my coffee a $12 drink today.
No, I see. I think, to be honest, I think that I would be more likely to tip if the option was 7, 9, 11%. But when they whip it around and it's 22 on a $5 coffee, it's a little bit weird.
I agree with you 100%, and I'm not tipping on a black coffee. All you did is pull a spigot, man. All right, our thanks to Kirk Grogan, co-founder and CEO of Tiphaus.